Hello, and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast is number 1403. The topic is Q&A, and the title is The Benefits of Bodybuilding Training for Strength Development. So, this came from a discussion with a fellow trainer. I love working with trainers. Actually, over half of my clients right now are personal trainers. Love it. It's super fun. We get into a lot of fun conversations. One of the conversations recently, the trainer asked, why do you have your powerlifting clients perform bodybuilding training even if they don't want to get bigger? So we were having a discussion about how to manage accessory lifts for powerlifters, for strength athletes. So for example, if you come into the gym, you do movement preparation, then you go do squats. Well, what do you do after squats? The movements you do after squats will be considered the accessory lifts. So the main lift is squat. Then accessory lifts are typically chosen to help contribute towards building your main lift. So in your squat, you would say, okay, well, what are some issues I'm having in my squat? Therefore, I want to train that with my accessory lifts. Maybe you get pitched forward in your squat. So maybe you'll start throwing in good mornings to get the sensation of kind of pushing back into the bar. Maybe you tend to drift forward on the way down, and that comes from tight hamstrings in adductors. So maybe one of your accessory lifts is actually just kind of like a split stance Bulgarian squat, like a split squat, maybe to a deficit, and that helps open up your adductors and strengthen them so they stay more open. So really, like, you would just choose movements based on what flaws or issues you see in the main lift. Now, the accessory lifts are typically done for different durations, like rep ranges. If you think of a main lift, you might do a single, maybe a double, maybe a triple, maybe sets of fives. But typically main lifts are done heavy with low rep count. That's not always the case. Definitely not that is always the way. There's millions of ways to set stuff up. But in general, often the main lift is done very heavy. Whereas, comparatively to accessory lifts, those are typically done lighter. Now, they might feel just as freaking hard, as the main lift, but it's just a lighter weight load. And it's typically done for longer time under tension, so higher rep rates. Now, again, that's not always the case, but we're just kind of talking about some generalities here to understand what this conversation is about. So if I was doing good mornings, maybe I'm doing sets of 6 to 10 because I'm not looking for maximal stimulus of like the strength to push the bar back. I more so want the stimulus to learn the sensation of doing it. So I want more repetitions to learn the sensation since I'm not really working on the strength aspect. So you would play around with these rep ranges and time under tension ranges, and they would help you perform better in that main lift. So if we look at, when we talk about the question of why do you have your powerlifters perform bodybuilding training even if they don't want to get bigger, what that's referring to is the accessory lifts, since they are typically lighter weight loads which allow for a little bit of heavier time, like a longer time under tension, they're still done to maximal effort. Meaning, if I'm going for 30 seconds or 40 seconds of a movement, and let's say that equates to 14 repetitions, I still want to try the heaviest freaking weight I can do for 14 reps. With perfect form, I'm going to talk about a lot of asterisks to what I just said there. But in general, you're going to try to maximize your ability to do that 14 reps. That would count as like what a bodybuilder would do. So let's say after a bench press with a barbell, I go and do dumbbell chest press because I want to just continue to develop my chest fibers through a bigger range of motion. So if I use dumbbells, maybe I can sink into a bigger stretch than with a barbell. Maybe if I go to a 15 or 30 degree incline, that helps me get a greater stretch in the upper fibers of my chest. And that way I can get better recruitment of my upper fibers to help contribute towards my flat bench. So there's a lot of reasons why you pick different movements. But if I was doing dumbbell incline presses, so I would think, okay, I'm going to do those. I want to have main focus on my chest. So I'm not going to look to just throw the weight around. I'm going to think of kind of flexing and squeezing my chest. That's just like a bodybuilder would do if a bodybuilder was coming in to grow their chest. So we're doing it as a strength athlete to increase neurological communication. Basically, you want to try to get your brain better at finding all of the muscle fibers that are available to it to help move a very heavy weight. So there's tons of reasons why powerlifters would do accessory lifts that are pretty much the exact same thing as bodybuilding. It's just called accessory lift rather than bodybuilding. So the name has changed, but nothing else really has changed. So an example we want to talk about here is if I am a power lifter and I don't really want to weigh more. Maybe I'm at the top of my weight class. I don't want to have to move up to a bigger weight class. Okay? But I do want to get stronger. Well, how can I maximize my ability to get stronger? You can actually incorporate bodybuilding training into your powerlifting training, even if you don't actually want to get bigger muscles. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, an example that the client and I were talking about was one of my clients. He competes at 148, shredded, absolutely peeled. He could, when we diet down and like do water cut for his competitions at 148, he could easily step on aesthetic stage and get like a freaking pro card for an aesthetic competition. Now, I've trained people for those pro cards, so I know that. I'm not just saying it. Like, he literally would be able to do it. He's freaking shredded, lean, great muscle definition, great muscle balance. He walks around typically between 155 to 160, but we diet down to 148. Not really a diet, we just water cut to 148 for competitions. Now, he doesn't really have any room to put on more muscle tissue. When we deplete to 148, it's like right on the dot that we can get to. The rest of it would just be forcing more and more water out, but there's no more fat left. Now, with that client, we still do bodybuilding training after his main lifts, and the question then is why? Well, real quick, let's do a quick definition again. I've kind of explained a little bit about the difference between strength and bodybuilding training, but I want to give kind of a little crystal clear kind of aspect here. Strength-based movements, you're typically looking for 20 seconds or less. So it's whatever repetitions like add up to 20 seconds or less. So whether it's 5 reps, 4 reps, 3 reps, 2 reps, it's 20 seconds or less typically. You're also going to have the movement be like you're going to try to incorporate momentum, and the whole concept and the whole focus is on the movement. You want maximum efficiency. You want to try to share the load across all available muscles. So strength-based training, not only do you have different time and attention, you also have different like method of executing the movement. Meaning you're focusing on just the movement in general, you're trying to share the weight loads across all muscles, and you're trying to use momentum. Whereas in bodybuilding, typically the time and attention range is 20 to 60 seconds. So a little bit lighter, but still kind of maximum intensity for 20 to 60 seconds. You don't want any momentum whatsoever, and it's more muscle focused. You're trying for actual maximum inefficiency. You're trying to overload a very specific muscle when you do bodybuilding training. Now, to help explain more of the difference there is podcast number 220. It's a training podcast titled Muscle Intention versus Movement Intention. And that can help kind of explain that when you do exercises as a bodybuilder, it's very different than doing exercises for strength. Bodybuilders happen to be strong, but they don't train to be strong. Now, there is a benefit to somebody if they're not strong yet, and they're a bodybuilder, to absolutely get strong. So if you're a bodybuilder and you can bench 405 for 10 reps, you probably don't need to focus too much more on strength. But if you're wanting to be a bodybuilder and you can only bench press 135 for 10, you probably want to get stronger. So depends on where your strength levels are, would depend on kind of what degree of focus do you give towards strength-based training as a bodybuilder. So if someone is a power lifter and they don't want to gain weight, meaning they don't want bigger muscles, why should they still train like a bodybuilder? Like, why should they do their accessories like a bodybuilder would? Well, there's a couple answers, and we're going to go through those. So one of the things is bodybuilding movements, different accessories, it introduces different angles. So, for example, if I was doing a flat bench press for the barbell, and then I brought up the idea of doing 15 or 30 degree inclined dumbbell presses, that difference in angle changes the stress load stimulus through the chest fibers. So on a slight incline, I'm going to get more stress across the upper chest fibers. If I was at a slight decline, I would get more stress across the lower portion of the chest fibers. And you can do this with pretty much any muscle. If you put it into different positions, you can emphasize different ends of the muscle and different kind of like pathways through the muscle. Whether you want dead center, left, right, up, down, all those things. So you can shape muscles very well, and that's part of exercise selection, is choosing the movements that target the exact area of the muscle that you want. Now, that's important for powerlifters, for strength athletes, because by stressing different fibers, it better ensures that all fibers of the muscle are like reinforced and strengthened structurally as well. This protects against tissue injury. So that way, if you're doing a squat and say you do get pitched forward a little bit, the tissues that you now are overloading into, because you're now in a different position because you're pitched forward, they're robust and structurally strong enough to not get immediately injured. So changing different angles, which is offered by bodybuilding training, helps improve the structural strength and integrity of all fibers, which protects against injury. Also, it increases your brain's, like your nervous system's, desire to recruit those fibers. So when we talk about strength, we're trying to recruit as many muscle fibers as possible to move the weight. If the brain knows that the fiber is strong, it'll recruit it. If it believes that it's weak, it will not. It won't put as much effort into kind of recruiting that, you won't get much out of it. If I strengthen all available fibers, your body will recruit more available fibers, and it'll try to share that weight load across all available fibers that it believes to be strong enough to actually contribute. So this, in turn, kind of increases communication to all fibers. More muscle fibers being annoyed, basically, which can happen with bodybuilding training, is by changing different angles, then also having longer time under tension ranges. And there's other techniques you can do, like rest pause and some other intensity techniques. But if you can annoy more fibers by doing this different style of training, like bodybuilding versus just strength lifts, if you can annoy more fibers, it leads to greater nervous system communication within those fibers, which increases their recruitment in heavy lifts. So bodybuilding style accessory lifts, they increase the structural stability of muscle fibers. They also then increase the communication of the nervous system to those fibers, which allows them to be more recruited in heavier lifts. Now, we also have just what's neat about it is the increase in the amount of stimulus that bodybuilding training offers compared to just strength-based training alone. So strength-based training alone, you can only do very heavy things, 20 seconds or less, to what you feel like your body can recover from. That's typically a lot less than the volume that you can do through bodybuilding. If you only use heavy lifts to increase kind of communication, meaning like strength development, nervous system development, you're very, very limited by how much you can actually train. By using slightly lighter weight loads, as in like bodybuilding weight loads, you'll more than double, you'll triple, or more than that, the volume of training, which means the volume, which equals opportunities of nervous system kind of development. So neurological communication to the muscle fibers. So it allows for increased muscle fiber kind of communication and annoyance, since bodybuilding uses lighter weight loads compared to maximal effort training. So you can do more overall repetitions, more overall volume. You get more repeated stimulus to the muscles. That leads to greater overall communication development, so neurological development. Then another benefit is the mental intensity management that bodybuilding offers, pain tolerance basically. So we know that in heavy lifting, if I unrack a bar that feels stupidly heavy for squatting, or even bench pressing, but let's say it was squats, you pick a bar up out of the rack and you're like, man, I'm gonna crush this thing, I'm gonna do so good, and then you start to unrack it, and all of a sudden you're like, holy crap, This feels miserable. This is so heavy. I feel like I'm about to get crushed. Your confidence has just got crushed. You're going to walk back shaky. You're going to think about trying to not mess up your cues rather than thinking about actually getting them right. You might miss the lift or you might get injured. Now, grinding through higher time under tension sets, as offered by bodybuilding training, it increases your mental ability to manage feeling overwhelmed, but still get your cues right. So in a sense, it gives you a chance to practice being overwhelmed. That way you can learn, okay, well, if I pay attention to my cues and I just execute each cue correctly, I'll be fine. I don't have to worry about maybe I'll mess them up, maybe I won't. I'm just going to do the cue and I'll be fine. That's what bodybuilding can help you, is it gives you more opportunities to learn that lesson rather than, 2 or 3 heavy squats once a week. The more opportunities you have to be mentally overwhelmed but still have to execute, it increases your ability to do so. So, bodybuilding-based training has a lot of benefits towards strength development. Now, a person might say, well, if you train like a bodybuilder, aren't you going to get bigger muscles? That defeats the purpose of what you wanted. You like, if you don't want your weight to go up, you can't train like a bodybuilder because you need bigger muscles. You only get bigger muscles from training like a bodybuilder if you eat like a bodybuilder. Bigger muscles are built in the kitchen, not in the gym. In the gym, you create damage to tissues. Then through what you eat, you can give enough material to repair those tissues, or you can give it even more material via protein to build newer, bigger tissues. So, if you train like a bodybuilder and you eat like a bodybuilder, you'd look like a bodybuilder. You'd have bigger muscles. If you train like a bodybuilder, but you control your calories and protein to provide sufficient needs for energy and repair, but without excess, then you will not gain bigger muscles. You won't gain weight. So there's no fear of gaining weight if you control your nutrition. Training like a bodybuilder doesn't make you bigger. Training like a bodybuilder and eating like a bodybuilder makes you bigger. So, that's many of the reasons why I include bodybuilding-based training for my powerlifting clients. We want to strengthen all of the fibers available to us to prevent injury. We want to stimulate all of the fibers available to us to increase maximal neurological recruitment for strength. It also helps us do that mental intensity kind of management. It's huge benefits. Huge benefits. So hopefully that was a fun way to kind of talk through that. Please go listen to podcast number 220 if you haven't. Again, that's titled Training, Muscle Intention versus Movement Intention. Really good podcast. So I thought that was a lot of fun. If you have any follow-up questions or you have anything you want to discuss or want to hear me discuss, just shoot me an email, brutalironjim@gmail.com. I love this stuff, so I'll be happy to make a podcast to answer any of your questions. Cool. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to this. If you do like our podcast, please consider sharing it. The more people we share the podcast with, the more people we can help. And that's kind of the whole goal, the whole point of doing this every day. And then thank you to the patrons of the podcast, people who financially support the podcast. The podcast is well over $1,000 a year. I give an hour to it every day. I really appreciate the financial help so we can pay those hosting costs. So thank you very much. If you do want to consider donating to the podcast, you can do so on our website. We have an option there to do a one-time donation, monthly donation, yearly donation. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated, and it does make a difference. So thank you very much. Also, if you like the information we share in our podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. If you have any questions, feedback, suggestions, anything you want to know, let us know at our email, brutalironjim@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.